Hi, my name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'll never forget the sound of my family's laughter echoing through the lawyer's office when all I inherited from Grandma Ruth was a tarnished brass key. While my cousins walked away with the house, the car, and thousands in cash, I clutched that old key, feeling like the universe's biggest joke. They whispered behind their hands about poor Sarah getting the scraps again, about how even in death, Grandma Ruth must have forgotten I existed. But when that bank manager slid his keycard and opened vault number 247, when he saw what my little key unlocked, the laughter died in their throats and suddenly everyone remembered my name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Grandma Ruth's funeral dawned gray and drizzling, as if even the sky understood that Cedar Falls was losing its brightest light. I stood at my bedroom window in my tiny apartment on Pine Street, watching the rain streak down the glass while I pressed the black dress I'd borrowed from my friend Emma. 28 years old, and I was borrowing clothes for my own grandmother's funeral because my teacher's salary barely covered rent and groceries, let alone a funeral-appropriate wardrobe. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Jessica. Make sure you're at Anderson's office by 2 p.m. sharp. We'll reading after the service. Try not to be late for once. The passive-aggressive tone was so perfectly Jessica that I could practically hear her manicured nails tapping against her phone screen as she typed it. In her world, my occasional tardiness was a character flaw, rather than the result of staying after school to help struggling students with their art projects. I slipped into the dress and caught my reflection in the mirror above my dresser. Sarah Mitchell stared back at me, brown hair pulled into a simple bun, hazel eyes that my grandmother used to say held too much hope for this harsh world. At 28, I was the family disappointment, the one who chose passion over profit by becoming an elementary art teacher instead of joining the family hardware business or marrying well like my cousins had done. The Mitchell family had owned Mitchell's Hardware on Main Street for 3 generations. It was a source of pride for everyone except me, apparently. While Uncle Bob had taken over the business and grown it into a small empire of 3 stores across the county, while Jessica had married a successful dentist and David had become a financial advisor, I had chosen paint-stained fingers and construction paper over cash registers and quarterly reports. Grandma Ruth was the only one who never made me feel small for my choices. Every Sunday, I'd visit her Victorian house on Maple Street, and we'd sit in her sun-filled kitchen drinking tea from her good china while she asked about my students and listened to my stories with genuine interest. She never once suggested I should be doing something more profitable with my life, never compared me to my more successful cousins, never made me feel like I was somehow lacking because I measured success in children's smiles rather than dollar signs. The funeral service at Cedar Falls Methodist was everything Grandma Ruth would have hated, stuffy and formal with too many flowers and not enough laughter. Uncle Bob delivered a eulogy that focused more on the family business legacy than on the woman who used to sneak extra cookies to neighborhood kids and kept a garden that fed half the block every summer. Jessica sobbed dramatically in the front row, though I noticed her makeup remained perfectly intact throughout the entire service. I sat in the back, listening to stories about a woman I barely recognized from the speeches. They talked about Ruth Mitchell, the business partner, Ruth Mitchell, the community leader, Ruth Mitchell, the patriarch's widow. No one mentioned Ruth Mitchell, the storyteller, who could spin tales that made rainy afternoons feel magical. No one talked about her terrible attempts at teaching me to knit, or how she'd let me paint murals on the walls of her basement when I was 12, and dreaming of becoming the next Georgia O'Keeffe. After the service, we gathered at the Rusty Anchor Diner for the traditional family meal. I found myself seated at the far end of the table, picking at a sandwich while listening to my relatives discuss property values and inheritance taxes. Jessica's husband, Brad, was explaining something about capital gains to David's wife, Monica, their voices carrying the casual confidence of people who never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. "Sarah, honey," Aunt Linda called down the table, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for addressing small children and the mentally impaired. "How's your little teaching job going? Still making those cute art projects with the kiddos?" The dismissal in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Cute art projects. As if teaching children to express themselves creatively was somehow less valuable than selling hammers and nails. I forced a smile and replied that my students were doing wonderfully, thank you for asking. I didn't mention that I'd spent my own money on art supplies because the school district's budget had been slashed again. I didn't talk about Tommy Martinez, who'd been acting out until he discovered he could pour his anger into abstract paintings. Or little Amy Chen, whose confidence bloomed when she realized she could create beauty with her own hands. That's nice, dear, Linda continued. Though I do hope you're thinking about your future. Teaching is so uncertain these days, isn't it? Maybe it's time to consider something more stable. Her gaze flickered meaningfully toward Uncle Bob, and I realized this was a family intervention disguised as casual conversation. Uncle Bob cleared his throat and leaned forward, his businessman's smile firmly in place. Actually, Sarah, I've been meaning to talk to you about an opportunity at the store. We could use someone to handle the paint department, maybe do some display work. Good benefits, steady income, room for advancement. The offer hung in the air like a trap disguised as kindness. I knew they meant well, in their way. They genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would choose uncertainty and passion over security and respectability. In their minds, they were trying to save me from myself. Thank you, Uncle Bob, that's really generous, but I love what I'm doing. My students need me, and I need them. I kept my voice steady, but I could see the looks exchanged across the table. Poor Sarah, too stubborn to accept help. Poor Sarah, too proud to admit her mistakes. Poor Sarah, destined to struggle forever because she refused to be practical. The conversation moved on to other topics, leaving me to finish my meal in relative peace. I found myself thinking about Grandma Ruth's last visit to my classroom 3 months ago. She'd sat in one of those tiny plastic chairs, her silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows, watching my second graders work on their self-portraits. Afterward, she told me that she could see the light in their eyes, the way they looked at me with trust and excitement. You're giving them something precious. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah, she'd said, don't let anyone convince you it's not important. At exactly 2 o'clock, we gathered in Thomas Anderson's law office on Elm Street. The waiting room smelled of leather and old papers, filled with heavy furniture that had probably been there since the 1940s. Mr. Anderson was a thin, precise man in his 60s who had handled the Mitchell family's legal affairs for decades. He ushered us into his conference room with the solemnity appropriate for such occasions. The will reading proceeded exactly as I'd expected. Uncle Bob, as the eldest son and business partner, inherited the controlling interest in Mitchell's hardware, along with significant cash assets. Jessica received the beautiful Victorian house on Maple Street, the one with the wraparound porch, and the garden that had been Grandma Ruth's pride and joy. David inherited her car, a pristine 1998 Buick that barely had 30,000 miles on it, plus her jewelry collection and a substantial savings account. Various aunts and uncles received smaller bequests, family heirlooms, and modest cash gifts that would help with their retirement funds. Even the neighbors got something. Mrs. Patterson received Grandma Ruth's collection of recipe books, and the Johnson family got her antique dining set. Then Mr. Anderson looked at me over his reading glasses, and I felt that familiar nod of anticipation in my stomach. To my granddaughter Sarah Mitchell, he read, his voice carrying the same formal tone he'd used for everyone else. Who has always seen beauty where others see only the ordinary, I leave this brass key. He reached into a manila envelope and withdrew something that made my heart sink to my shoes. It was old, maybe 4 inches long, made of brass that had darkened with age and tarnish. The head was ornate in the Victorian style, with decorative scroll work that had worn smooth in places. There was no tag, no explanation, no indication of what it might open. Just an old key that looked like it belonged in an antique shop rather than someone's inheritance. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the mixture of pity and confusion radiating from my family members. Uncle Bob cleared his throat uncomfortably. Jessica's perfectly glossed lips pressed together in what might have been sympathy or suppressed laughter. David actually snorted, then tried to cover it with a cough. Is there any additional documentation? Uncle Bob asked Mr. Anderson. Any explanation of what the key opens or where it might be used? Mr. Anderson shook his head slowly. I'm afraid not. Mrs. Mitchell was quite specific about the bequests, but provided no additional information about this particular item. He handed me the key, and I noticed how heavy it felt in my palm, the metal warm despite the cool temperature of the office. Well, Aunt Linda said, her voice bright with forced cheer, that's certainly interesting. I'm sure it has sentimental value, doesn't it, Sarah? Maybe it opens something in the house, Jessica. You'll have to let Sarah come by and figure out what it's for. Jessica nodded absently, already mentally rearranging the furniture in her new house. Of course, anytime. Though I can't imagine what it could be. I've been through every room in that house a dozen times helping Grandma with various things. I've never seen anything that would need such an old-fashioned key. I stared down at the key, feeling a familiar sensation that I'd learned to associate with disappointment. It wasn't that I'd expected much. Grandma Ruth had been comfortable but not wealthy, and there were many family members with greater financial needs than mine. But somehow I'd hoped for something more meaningful than what appeared to be a random piece of old hardware. Perhaps it's symbolic, suggested David's wife Monica, her voice carrying the kind of patronizing kindness reserved for consoling children who didn't get the toy they wanted. Maybe it represents opening new doors in your life, Sarah. New opportunities. The metaphor was so heavy-handed that I almost laughed. Instead, I managed a weak smile and slipped the key into my purse. I'm sure that's it. Grandma Ruth always did love her symbolism. As we filed out of the law office, I could hear the whispered conversations behind me. Poor thing, she must be so disappointed. What was Ruth thinking, giving her such an odd thing? Maybe there's something we don't know about it. Well, you know how Ruth could be sometimes. A little eccentric in her old age. The assumption that Grandma Ruth had been suffering from some age-related confusion stung more than the meager inheritance itself. My grandmother had been sharp as a tack right up until her sudden heart attack. She'd balanced her own checkbook, managed her investments, and could still beat anyone in the family at Scrabble. The idea that she'd randomly given me an old key because she was becoming senile felt like an insult to her memory. Jessica caught up with me in the parking lot, her high heels clicking against the wet asphalt. Sarah, I really am sorry about the key thing. I mean, I'm sure there's more to it than we understand. Grandma Ruth always had her reasons for everything. I appreciated the effort, even if it felt hollow. Thanks, Jess. I'm sure you're right. Listen, I was thinking about what Monica said. Maybe this is Grandma's way of telling you it's time for a change. Maybe you should consider Uncle Bob's offer about working at the store. I know it's not your dream job, but dreams don't pay the bills, you know? There it was again, the assumption that my life was somehow incomplete or unsuccessful because I wasn't accumulating wealth at the same rate as everyone else. I understood that they genuinely thought they were helping, but their version of help always seemed to involve me becoming someone else entirely. I'll think about it, I said, which was easier than explaining for the 100th time that I actually loved my job, that I woke up excited to see my students, that the satisfaction of watching a child discover their own creativity was worth more to me than any salary increase. That evening, I sat in my small apartment holding the brass key up to the light, turning it over in my hands and examining every detail. The craftsmanship was beautiful, with tiny flowers and vines carved into the metal. Someone had spent considerable time creating this key, which suggested it opened something important. But what? I'd grown up in that house on Maple Street, spent countless hours exploring every room, every closet, every nook and cranny. There were no mysterious locked doors, no hidden compartments, no antique furniture that might require such an ornate key. The house had been thoroughly modernized over the years, with standard door locks and windows that opened with simple latches. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and I felt grateful for the distraction. So how did it go? She asked without preamble. Emma Rodriguez had been my best friend since college, the only person in my life who understood why I'd chosen teaching over more lucrative career options. She was a social worker, which meant she was familiar with the concept of choosing purpose over profit. Jessica got the house, David got the car and jewelry, Uncle Bob got the business assets, and I got a mystery key that opens nothing. A key? That's it? That's it. Just an old brass key with no explanation, no clue what it opens. Nothing. The family thinks Grandma Ruth was getting senile. Emma was quiet for a moment. Sarah, your grandmother was one of the sharpest people I ever met. Remember when she figured out that your cousin David was skimming from the petty cash at the store by analyzing the receipt patterns? She caught that months before anyone else even suspected. I know, but what else could it be? I've been through every inch of that house. There's nothing that this key could possibly open. Have you considered that maybe it doesn't open something in the house? Maybe it opens something else entirely. The possibility hadn't occurred to me. I'd been so focused on the house, on the familiar spaces of my childhood, that I hadn't thought beyond those walls. Like what? I don't know. Safety deposit box? Storage unit? Maybe something at the hardware store? Your grandmother was involved in that business for 50 years. After we hung up, I found myself staring at the key with new eyes. Emma was right. Grandma Ruth had been anything but senile, and she'd been intimately involved with every aspect of the family business until Uncle Bob had gently pushed her into retirement 5 years ago. If anyone would have had reason to maintain a safety deposit box or storage unit, it would have been her. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove downtown to the First National Bank of Cedar Falls, where the Mitchell family had done business for decades. The building was an imposing structure of red brick and limestone, built in the 1920s when banks were designed to convey stability and permanence. I had been inside countless times over the years, cashing paychecks and making deposits, but I'd never paid attention to the safety deposit box area. At the customer service desk, I explained my situation to a young teller named Brandon, who looked like he'd graduated from high school about 5 minutes ago. He listened politely, examined my key, and shook his head. I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell, but this doesn't look like any of our current safety deposit box keys. We switched to a new system about 10 years ago, and all our keys look completely different now. He handed back the brass key with an apologetic smile. You might try some of the other banks in town. I spent the rest of the morning driving from bank to bank, credit union to credit union, showing my key to increasingly bewildered customer service representatives. The responses were all variations on the same theme. That's not one of ours. We've never used keys like that. Have you tried the First National? By noon, I was ready to give up. I sat in my car outside Cedar Falls Community Bank, the last financial institution on my list, staring at the key and fighting back tears of frustration. Maybe my family had been right. Maybe this was just a meaningless trinket, a random piece of old hardware that Grandma Ruth had found in a drawer somewhere and mistakenly thought had significance. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Hope you're feeling better. Don't forget about the estate sale planning meeting tomorrow. We need to start going through Grandma's things. The reminder that I'd called in sick made me feel guilty, but not guilty enough to return to school, when I felt like I was on the verge of solving a mystery that might be the key to understanding my grandmother's final gift to me. I decided to make one more stop before admitting defeat. The First National Bank had been around longer than any other institution in town, and if anyone might have information about old safety deposit boxes or historical banking practices, it would be them. This time, instead of approaching the customer service desk, I asked to speak with a manager. James Parker was probably in his 50s, with gray hair and the kind of calm demeanor that inspired confidence in financial matters. His office was lined with books about banking history and local Cedar Falls memorabilia. When I explained my situation, he examined the key with much more interest than anyone else had shown. This is quite old, he said, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship is beautiful. Victorian era, I'd guess. Maybe 1890s or early 1900s. The thing is, Miss Mitchell, this doesn't look like a safety deposit box key at all. My heart sank. Oh, then what do you think it might be? He leaned back in his chair, still studying the key. Well, safety deposit boxes use very specific keys with particular cuts and shapes for security reasons. This key is more decorative, more like what you'd use for a special piece of furniture, or perhaps a private vault. A private vault? In the old days, before modern banking systems, Wealthy families sometimes maintained private vaults, either in their homes or in secure buildings. Banks would sometimes manage these vaults for their customers, especially during the early 1900s when people were more suspicious of government institutions. He handed back the key and reached for a thick ledger book from his shelf. The thing is, Miss Mitchell, this bank has been in operation since 1898. We have records going back to our founding, including some very old vault rental agreements. If your grandmother's family maintained a private vault through this bank, there might be a record of it. Hope flickered in my chest like a candle in the wind. Would you be willing to check? Absolutely. It might take some time to go through the old records, but it's certainly worth investigating. The Mitchell family has been banking with us for generations. If there's a vault registered under that name, we'll find it. As Mr. Parker disappeared into the bank's basement archives, I sat in his office trying to contain my excitement. This felt different from the morning's wild goose chase. This felt like the beginning of an answer to the riddle Grandma Ruth had left behind. 20 minutes later, Mr. Parker returned with a dust-covered ledger and an expression of amazement on his face. Miss Mitchell, he said, settling behind his desk and opening the book to a page marked with a yellowed piece of paper, I have some rather extraordinary news. According to our records, your great-great-grandfather, William Mitchell, established a private vault with this bank in 1902. The rental fees have been paid annually, in advance, for the past 122 years. I stared at him, trying to process this information. Paid by whom? Initially by William Mitchell, then by his son Robert Mitchell Sr., then by Robert Mitchell Jr., and for the past 40 years by one Ruth Eleanor Mitchell. He looked up from the ledger with barely contained enthusiasm. Miss Mitchell, your grandmother has been maintaining this vault for 4 decades. According to our records, she's the only person who's accessed it in all that time, and she last visited it approximately 6 months ago. The room seemed to spin around me. 6 months ago, Grandma Ruth had still been healthy, still sharp, still very much herself. Whatever she'd done in that vault, it had been intentional and recent. Can I see it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Parker smiled. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd ask. The vault is located in our basement level, in what we call the heritage section. It's not used for modern safety deposit boxes, but we've maintained it for historical purposes, and for the few remaining private vault holders. He stood up and reached for his keys. Would you like to see it now? I followed him through the main banking floor, past the teller windows and customer service desks, to an elevator I'd never noticed before. As we descended to the basement level, Mr. Parker explained that the bank's lower level had been designed as a fortress, with reinforced concrete walls and sophisticated security systems that had been cutting edge in the early 1900s. The basement was cool and quiet, lit by modern fluorescent fixtures that had been installed over the original architecture. We walked down a hallway lined with small doors, each marked with a number and a nameplate. At the very end of the corridor, Mr. Parker stopped in front of a door marked 247 Mitchell Family Trust. This is it, he said, stepping aside so I could see the brass lock set into the heavy wooden door. The key should fit right there. With trembling hands, I inserted the brass key into the lock. It slid in perfectly, as if it had been waiting over a century for this moment. The mechanism turned smoothly, and I heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. Mr. Parker helped me swing open the heavy door, and I stepped into a small room that took my breath away. The vault was perhaps 8 feet square, with stone walls and a high ceiling. But it wasn't the architecture that made me gasp. It was the contents. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, and every available surface was covered with carefully organized documents, photographs, and artifacts that seemed to span more than a century. But what caught my attention immediately were the paintings. There had to be at least 30 canvases of various sizes, all turned to face the wall except for one that sat on an easel in the center of the room. I stepped closer to the easel, and my knees nearly buckled. Staring back at me was a painting I recognized from my art history textbooks, a piece I'd shown to countless students over the years when teaching them about American Impressionism. It was a Mary Cassatt, one of her famous mother and child portraits, but this wasn't a reproduction or a print. The brushstrokes were visible, the paint thick with texture, the colors more vibrant than any photograph could capture. Mr. Parker, I whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow damage the masterpiece in front of me. Is that real? James Parker stepped into the vault behind me, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to genuine amazement. Ms. Mitchell, I have to admit, in 25 years of banking, I've never seen anything quite like this. He moved carefully around the small space, examining the shelves of documents and the collection of turned paintings. Your grandmother never mentioned what she was storing down here. Bank policy requires us to maintain client confidentiality, so we never asked for details as long as the rental fees were paid. I turned to look at the other paintings, my hands shaking as I carefully rotated the first canvas to face the room. It was a landscape, painted in the Hudson River School style, depicting a dramatic mountains scene with a waterfall cascading through autumn foliage. The signature in the corner read T. Cole, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Thomas Cole was one of the founding fathers of American landscape painting, and his original works were worth millions. The next painting made me gasp out loud. It was unmistakably a Georgia O'Keeffe, one of her famous flower paintings, rendered in the bold, sensual style that had made her one of America's most celebrated artists. The petals seemed to glow from within, painted in shades of pink and coral that captured light in a way that photographs never could. Mr. Parker, I think we need to call someone, I said, my voice barely steady. These paintings, if they're authentic, they're worth more money than I can even comprehend. As I continued examining the collection, I found works that represented a survey of American art spanning nearly 2 centuries. There was what appeared to be a John Singer Sargent portrait, a Grant Wood landscape that wasn't his famous American Gothic, but carried his distinctive style. Several pieces that looked like they might be from the Ashcan School, and a collection of more contemporary works that I couldn't immediately identify but which clearly showed the hand of trained masters. But it wasn't just paintings. One shelf contained a series of sketchbooks, their leather covers worn with age. I opened the first one carefully and found myself looking at page after page of preliminary sketches and studies, many signed by artists whose names I recognized from museum placards. These weren't just finished artworks. They were the working documents of some of America's most important painters, providing insight into their creative processes that scholars would give anything to examine. Another shelf held what appeared to be personal correspondence. I picked up a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and saw that the return address read, Mary Cassatt, Paris, France. The letters were addressed to my dear William, and the dates ranged from 1895 to 1902. My great-great-grandfather had apparently maintained a personal correspondence with one of the most important female artists in American history. Mr. Parker was examining a large wooden filing cabinet that occupied one corner of the vault. Miss Mitchell, there's an entire filing system here, organized by year going back to 1902. It looks like your family has been documenting these acquisitions for over a century. He pulled out a folder marked 1902 to 1905 and handed it to me. These appear to be purchase receipts, authentication documents, and provenance records. I opened the folder with hands that were now shaking uncontrollably. The first document was a bill of sale dated March 15, 1902, for one oil painting, Mother and Child at Bath by Mary Cassatt, purchased for the sum of $300. In 1902, that would have been a significant amount of money, but today, that same painting would be worth several $1,000,000. The next document was even more remarkable. It was a letter from Thomas Cole himself, dated 1846, thanking William Mitchell for his generous patronage and his, quote, commitment to supporting American artists during these challenging times. The letter went on to discuss Cole's financial struggles and his gratitude for collectors like William, who were willing to purchase works directly from artists rather than waiting for them to achieve posthumous fame. As I continued reading through the documents, a picture began to emerge of my great-great-grandfather that was completely different from the family stories I'd grown up hearing. William Mitchell hadn't just been a successful hardware store owner. He'd been a passionate art collector and patron who had used his wealth to support American artists during some of the most important periods in the nation's artistic development. Look at this, Mr. Parker said, pulling out a leather-bound ledger from another shelf. This appears to be a comprehensive catalog of the collection, with detailed notes about each piece. He opened the book and showed me pages of meticulous handwriting documenting every painting, sketch, and letter in the vault. Your great-great-grandfather was incredibly organized. Every acquisition is documented with purchase date, price paid, and often notes about the circumstances of the purchase. I took the ledger from him and flipped through pages that read like a who's who of American art history. William Mitchell had apparently purchased works directly from artists' studios, often paying cash during times when the artists were struggling financially. There were entries for purchases made during the economic panics of the late 1800s, when many artists were desperate for buyers, and notes indicating that William had often paid more than the asking price to help artists through difficult periods. One entry particularly caught my attention. It was dated December 1901 and documented the purchase of 3 paintings from a young artist named O'Keeffe, recently arrived from Wisconsin, showing great promise despite her youth. Georgia O'Keeffe would have been barely 14 years old in 1901, just beginning her artistic education. Somehow, my great-great-grandfather had recognized her talent decades before the rest of the world caught on. "Mr. Parker," I said, closing the ledger and looking around the vault with new understanding, "I think my family has been keeping one of the most important private art collections in American history hidden in your basement for over a century." He nodded slowly, his expression shifting from amazement to something approaching awe. "Miss Mitchell, if these works are authentic and based on the documentation you're showing me, I believe they are, we're looking at a collection that could be worth tens of millions of dollars, possibly more." The magnitude of what I was seeing began to sink in. My grandmother hadn't left me a worthless key. She'd left me a treasure that represented not just enormous financial value, but an incredible piece of American cultural history. The family had always known that William Mitchell had been successful, but none of us had any idea that his success had extended beyond the hardware business into the world of art collecting. But why had this collection remained hidden for so long? Why hadn't any of the subsequent generations of Mitchells known about these paintings? I found part of the answer in another folder, this one marked Family Correspondence 1920 to 1950. The folder contained letters between various Mitchell family members, discussing the collection and the decision to keep it private. A letter from William's son, Robert Mitchell Sr., dated 1925, explained the family's reasoning. "Father's art collection represents not just monetary value, but artistic and cultural significance that extends far beyond our family's needs. We have decided to maintain the collection as a trust, to be revealed when the time is right, when there is a family member who can truly appreciate its artistic value, rather than simply its monetary worth." The letters went on to discuss how each generation had maintained the vault, with one family member designated as the guardian, who would ensure the collection's preservation and eventually pass the responsibility to the most appropriate heir in the next generation. The role had passed from William to his son Robert, then to Robert's son Robert Jr., then to Ruth when she married into the family in the 1960s. A letter from my grandfather, Robert Jr., to Grandma Ruth, dated 1968, made the selection criteria clear. "Ruth, you have shown yourself to be someone who understands the true value of art, not just as decoration, but as expression of the human spirit. I trust you to maintain this collection, and, when the time comes, to choose an heir who will appreciate its cultural significance, rather than simply see it as a financial windfall." Another folder contained more recent correspondence, including letters from art historians and museum curators, who had apparently been trying for decades to locate various lost works from the artists represented in the collection. A letter from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, dated just 5 years ago, inquired about a missing Mary Cassatt painting that had been sold to a private collector named Mitchell in 1902 and had disappeared from public view. The museum was offering to purchase the work for $12 million if it could be located. I sat down heavily on a small wooden stool that had been placed in the corner of the vault, trying to process everything I was learning. My grandmother had maintained this incredible secret for 40 years, caring for a collection that represented not just enormous wealth, but significant cultural heritage. And she had chosen me to inherit it, not because I was the most financially needy family member, but because I was the only one who would understand its true value. Mr. Parker was examining what appeared to be a more recent addition to the collection, a painting that showed Grandma Ruth's distinctive handwriting on the back. Miss Mitchell, this appears to be something your grandmother added to the collection within the past few years. It's not cataloged in the main ledger, but there's a separate notation here. I moved to look at the painting he was holding. It was smaller than most of the others, painted in a more contemporary style that I didn't immediately recognize. But when I saw the signature, my knees nearly gave out. It was signed R. Mitchell in my grandmother's careful script. She painted this herself, I whispered, taking the canvas from Mr. Parker's hands. The painting depicted the view from Grandma Ruth's kitchen window, showing her garden in full summer bloom with the neighbor children playing in the background. It was painted with a confidence and skill that I had never known my grandmother possessed. A note attached to the back of the painting, written in Grandma Ruth's handwriting, explained everything. My dear Sarah, by the time you read this, you will have discovered the Mitchell family's greatest treasure. But this painting represents something even more precious to me. It was inspired by watching you work with your students, seeing how you help them discover the artist within themselves. Art is not about monetary value, Sarah. It is about the human capacity to create beauty, to express truth, to touch other souls through color and form. This collection is not just about the famous names on these canvases. It is about the continuing tradition of supporting and nurturing artistic expression. I know you will understand what to do with this responsibility. I clutched the painting to my chest, tears streaming down my face as I finally understood what my grandmother had been trying to tell me. This wasn't just about inheriting money or valuable artwork. This was about inheriting a mission, a family tradition of supporting artists and preserving cultural heritage that had been maintained for over a century. Mr. Parker cleared his throat gently. Miss Mitchell, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what do you plan to do with all of this? A collection of this magnitude and significance requires careful handling, proper insurance, climate control, security measures. It's not something that can simply be stored in someone's home. The question forced me to think beyond the immediate shock of discovery to the practical implications of what I'd inherited. These paintings needed to be properly preserved, and, more importantly, they needed to be seen. Art locked away in a vault, no matter how secure, couldn't fulfill its true purpose of inspiring and educating people. I thought about my students, about how their eyes lit up when I showed them reproductions of famous paintings, about how they tried to recreate the techniques they admired in their own small projects. I thought about Tommy Martinez, who had found his voice through abstract painting, and Amy Chen, whose confidence had grown through artistic expression. What would it mean to those children, and thousands of others like them, to see these masterpieces in person? Mr. Parker, I said, wiping my eyes and trying to steady my voice. I think I need to make some phone calls. This collection doesn't belong hidden away. It belongs where people can see it, where it can inspire the next generation of artists. He nodded approvingly. That sounds like exactly what your great-great-grandfather would have wanted. From what I've read in these documents, he wasn't just collecting art for investment purposes. He was supporting artists because he believed in the importance of creative expression. As we prepared to leave the vault, I took one last look around the small room that had held my family's secret for over a century. Tomorrow, everything would change. The family that had laughed at my worthless inheritance would have to reckon with the fact that I'd been entrusted with something beyond their comprehension. Uncle Bob, with all his business success, had never been trusted with this responsibility. Jessica, for all her social connections, hadn't been chosen to carry on this tradition. David, despite his financial expertise, had been deemed unsuitable for this inheritance. Grandma Ruth had looked at all of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren and had chosen the art teacher, the family disappointment, the one who chose passion over profit. She had seen something in me that the rest of the family had missed, something that made her believe I would be the right person to carry forward the Mitchell family's artistic legacy. As we locked the vault and made our way back to Mr. Parker's office, I began to formulate a plan. The collection was too important to remain hidden, but it was also too valuable to handle carelessly. I would need to contact art historians, museum curators, insurance companies, and legal experts. But most importantly, I would need to find a way to honor both the artistic significance of the collection and my family's century-long tradition of supporting American artists. The key that had seemed so worthless just hours earlier had unlocked not just a vault, but a new understanding of my family's history and my own place within it. Grandma Ruth had been right to choose me, not because I was the most successful or the most practical family member, but because I was the one who would understand what really mattered about this incredible inheritance. As I sat in my car outside the First National Bank holding the brass key that had changed everything, I realized that my life had just taken a turn that no one, especially my family, could have predicted. The art teacher who couldn't even afford a proper funeral dress was now the guardian of one of the most significant private art collections in American history. And tomorrow, when I called my family to share this news, the laughter would finally stop. That evening, I sat in my small apartment staring at my phone, the brass key resting on my coffee table like a talisman that had transformed my entire world. The weight of what I'd discovered pressed down on me with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. In the span of a single afternoon, I'd gone from being the family disappointment to the guardian of what could be the most significant private art collection in American history. I'd spent the drive home from the bank in a daze, my mind reeling with images of those incredible paintings and the implications of what they represented. The Mary Cassatt alone, according to the museum correspondence I'd found, was worth $12 million. But the collection contained dozens of pieces, many by artists whose works commanded even higher prices at auction. The financial value was staggering, but more importantly, the cultural significance was immeasurable. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "How are you feeling? Any better today?" I'd completely forgotten about calling in sick that morning. The lie I'd told to pursue the mystery of the key now seemed trivial compared to what I'd uncovered. How could I explain to anyone that I'd spent the day discovering a hidden family legacy that spanned over a century? I texted back, "Much better. Can you come over? I need to tell you something incredible." While I waited for Emma to arrive, I found myself researching the artists whose works I'd seen in the vault. Using my laptop, I pulled up auction records and museum catalogs, trying to understand the true scope of what I'd inherited. A Thomas Cole landscape similar to the one in the vault had sold at Sotheby's 2 years ago for $8 million. The Georgia O'Keeffe flower painting I'd seen could easily be worth $15 million or more, especially given its early date and the documentation proving its provenance. But the more I researched, the more I realized that the monetary value, enormous as it was, wasn't the most remarkable aspect of the collection. Many of these works were considered lost by art historians. Museums and scholars had been searching for them for decades, knowing they existed based on historical records but unable to locate them. The Metropolitan Museum's letter about the missing Cassatt was just one example of what appeared to be a common situation. Emma arrived 30 minutes later with a bottle of wine and a concerned expression. "You sounded strange in your text. What's going on? And why are you holding that old key like it's made of gold?" I poured us each a glass of wine and tried to figure out where to begin. How do you tell someone that your grandmother left you a treasure that most people only dream about? How do you explain that the family member everyone pitied has just inherited something that could change not just her life but the entire landscape of American art history? "Emma, remember how everyone laughed yesterday when I inherited just this key? How they all felt sorry for me because I got the worthless trinket while everyone else got real money and property?" She nodded, settling into my couch with her wine. "Your family can be really awful sometimes. I still can't believe your cousin made that comment about Grandma Ruth being senile. Well, it turns out Grandma Ruth was sharper than any of us could have imagined." I took a deep breath and launched into the story of my day, starting with my visit to the bank and ending with the discovery of the vault. Emma listened in stunned silence as I described the paintings, the documentation, and the century-long family tradition that none of us had known existed. When I finished, Emma sat quietly for a long moment, staring at the brass key on my coffee table. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of amazement and something that might have been awe. "Sarah, do you realize what this means?" You're not just rich now, you're wealthy in a way that most people can't even comprehend. But more than that, you're the guardian of pieces of American history that scholars have been searching for their entire careers. The reality of the situation was still sinking in. I know. And I have no idea what to do with that responsibility. These paintings can't just sit in a bank vault for another century. They need to be seen, studied, appreciated. But they also can't be handled carelessly. Some of these works are irreplaceable pieces of our cultural heritage. Emma leaned forward, her social worker instincts kicking in. Have you thought about what you're going to tell your family? Because once this news gets out, and it will get out, everything is going to change for you. People are going to treat you differently, want things from you, expect things from you. I hadn't really considered that aspect yet. My focus had been on processing the immediate shock of discovery and trying to understand what I'd inherited. But Emma was right. Once my family learned about the collection, our entire dynamic would shift. Uncle Bob, who had offered me a job in the paint department out of pity, would have to reckon with the fact that I was now wealthier than he could ever hope to be. Jessica, who had felt sorry for me getting just a key, would have to accept that Grandma Ruth had trusted me with something far more valuable than a house. I think I need to call some experts before I tell my family anything, I said finally. Mr. Parker gave me the names of some art historians and appraisers who work with the bank on authentication issues. I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions about what to do next. Emma nodded approvingly. That's smart. But Sarah, can I ask you something? How are you feeling about all this? I mean, yesterday you were struggling to pay your electric bill, and today you're potentially one of the wealthiest people in Cedar Falls. That's got to be overwhelming. She was right. The emotional impact of the discovery was almost as difficult to process as the practical implications. For my entire adult life, I'd lived paycheck to paycheck, carefully budgeting every expense and making countless small sacrifices to pursue my passion for teaching. I'd grown accustomed to being the family member who couldn't afford to contribute meaningfully to group gifts, who had to decline invitations to expensive restaurants, who wore the same dress to every formal occasion because it was the only one I owned. Now, suddenly, I had access to wealth that could solve every financial problem I'd ever had, and many I'd never even imagined having. But more than that, I'd been entrusted with a responsibility that felt far more significant than any amount of money. The artists whose works filled that vault had created something transcendent, something that spoke to the human experience across generations and cultures. And somehow, through a chain of family guardianship that stretched back over a century, that responsibility had fallen to me. I keep thinking about my students, I told Emma, about how excited they get when I show them reproductions of famous paintings, how they try to copy the techniques in their own little projects. What would it mean to children like that to see these works in person? To understand that art isn't just something that happens in faraway museums, but something that can be part of their daily lives? Emma smiled, and I could see in her expression that she understood exactly what I was feeling. You're already thinking like your great-great-grandfather, aren't you? About how to use this collection to support and inspire artists, especially young ones. She was right. The more I thought about the collection, the more I felt drawn to the idea of sharing it in a way that would honor both the artists who had created these masterpieces and the family tradition of supporting artistic expression. But I also felt the weight of making the right decision, of being worthy of the trust that Grandma Ruth had placed in me. The next morning, I called the first name on Mr. Parker's list, Drive. Margaret Steinberg, a professor of art history at Ohio State University, who specialized in American art of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her secretary initially tried to schedule an appointment for the following month, but when I mentioned that I had inherited a collection that included works by Mary Cassatt, Thomas Cole, and Georgia O'Keeffe, Dr. Steinberg herself came on the line within minutes. Miss Mitchell, I have to tell you that I receive calls like this fairly regularly, and unfortunately, most of them turn out to involve reproductions or works that have been misattributed. However, if you truly have authentic pieces by the artists you mentioned, particularly with proper provenance documentation, I would be very interested in examining them. Would it be possible for you to bring photographs and documentation to my office this afternoon? I explained that the works were currently secured in a bank vault, and that I had extensive documentation dating back to the original purchases. Dr. Steinberg's tone shifted immediately from polite skepticism to genuine excitement. Miss Mitchell, if you have purchase receipts and provenance documentation from the early 1900s, that would be extraordinarily valuable from a scholarly perspective, regardless of the authenticity of the works themselves. Could you possibly bring some of that documentation with you? I'd be happy to clear my schedule to meet with you today. 3 hours later, I sat in Dr. Steinberg's office at Ohio State, watching her examine photocopies of the documents I'd found in the vault. I'd spent the morning back at the bank with Mr. Parker, carefully photographing the most significant pieces of correspondence and documentation. The originals were far too valuable to remove from the secure environment of the vault, but the photocopies provided enough detail for Dr. Steinberg to begin her assessment. Dr. Steinberg was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, and the kind of focused intensity that I associated with serious scholars. She wore minimal makeup and simple clothing, but her eyes lit up with genuine passion as she examined each document. Miss Mitchell, she said, looking up from a photocopy of the 1902 letter from Thomas Cole, if these documents are authentic, and I have every reason to believe they are based on the paper, ink, and handwriting analysis I can do from these copies, you have inherited something that extends far beyond monetary value. This collection represents primary source material that could reshape our understanding of the American art market in the early 1900s. She pointed to the letter from Mary Cassatt that I'd found in the vault. We know from other sources that Cassatt was selling works directly to American collectors during this period, but we've never had such detailed correspondence documenting these transactions. This letter not only proves the authenticity of the painting you described, but it provides insight into Cassatt's relationship with her American patrons that scholars have been speculating about for decades. Dr. Steinberg continued examining the documents, occasionally making soft exclamations of amazement or excitement. When she reached the photocopies of the catalog that William Mitchell had maintained, she actually gasped out loud. "This is incredible. Your great-great-grandfather wasn't just collecting art, he was documenting it with a thoroughness that rivals modern museum practices. Look at these entries." She showed me a page where William had recorded not just the purchase details, but notes about the artist's financial situation, the historical context of the work, and even his personal response to the piece. This level of documentation is what we dream of finding when we're trying to establish provenance for historical works. She looked up at me with an expression that bordered on reverence. "Miss Mitchell, I need to ask you this directly. Are you planning to sell this collection? Because if you are, there are museums and private collectors who would pay extraordinary sums for pieces of this caliber with this level of documentation." The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding since the previous day. What was I going to do with the collection? The practical side of my brain recognized that selling even a few pieces would solve every financial problem I'd ever had. I could pay off my student loans, buy a house, maybe even start my own art school for children from low-income families. But something about that option felt wrong, like a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in me. My great-great-grandfather hadn't assembled this collection as an investment portfolio. He'd built it as a way of supporting American artists during crucial periods in their careers. The family had maintained it for over a century, not because they were waiting for the right time to cash in, but because they understood its cultural significance. Dr. Steinberg, I honestly don't know what I'm going to do yet. This is all very new to me, and I want to make sure I make the right decision. But I can tell you that selling the collection to private collectors doesn't feel like the right answer. These works were meant to be seen and appreciated, not locked away in someone's private residence. She nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right instinct. Miss Mitchell, would you be open to the possibility of loaning some of these works to museums for exhibition? Many institutions would be thrilled to display pieces like this, and it would allow the public to appreciate them while keeping the collection intact. The idea appealed to me immediately. I thought about my students again, about how much it would mean to them to visit a museum and see works that had been hidden for over a century. I thought about other teachers trying to inspire their students to appreciate art, and how much more effective their lessons would be if the children could see these masterpieces in person. That sounds like something I'd be very interested in exploring, I told her. But I imagine there are legal and practical considerations that I don't understand yet. Dr. Steinberg spent the next hour explaining the world of museum loans, insurance requirements, and the complex legal frameworks that govern the exhibition of valuable artworks. She also provided me with the names of several other experts I should consult, including art authenticators, insurance specialists, and attorneys who specialized in cultural property law. As our meeting concluded, Dr. Steinberg made a request that surprised me. "Miss Mitchell, would you be willing to consider allowing me to write about this discovery? Obviously, I would need your permission and would work with you to ensure your privacy is protected, but this collection represents a significant addition to our understanding of American art history. The scholarly community needs to know about this." I hadn't considered the academic implications of the collection, but Dr. Steinberg's excitement made it clear that the discovery had significance beyond what I'd realized. What would that involve exactly? Initially, just a paper for an academic journal, documenting the collection and its historical significance. But eventually, this could warrant a book, maybe even a traveling exhibition, that would allow people across the country to see these works. Miss Mitchell, you have the opportunity to make a genuine contribution to American cultural history. The conversation left me feeling both excited and overwhelmed. I was beginning to understand that inheriting this collection meant taking on responsibilities that extended far beyond my own life or even my family's history. These paintings belonged in some sense to the American people, and I had been entrusted with the task of ensuring they could fulfill their purpose of inspiring and educating future generations. Driving back to Cedar Falls, I found myself thinking about Grandma Ruth's note and her painting of the garden scene. She had understood something that I was just beginning to grasp, that art wasn't about ownership or monetary value, but about the continuing human need to create and appreciate beauty. The collection wasn't really mine in any permanent sense. I was just the current guardian, responsible for ensuring that it continued to serve its intended purpose. When I arrived home, I found a message on my answering machine from Jessica. "Sarah, I hope you're feeling better. I wanted to let you know that we've scheduled the estate sale for this weekend. We'll need to go through Grandma's things and price everything. Can you come by tomorrow evening to help? Also, I've been thinking about that key thing. Maybe we can have it appraised or something, just in case it has some antique value." The irony of Jessica's message was almost overwhelming. While she was planning to sell Grandma Ruth's furniture and household items for whatever small amounts they might bring, I was grappling with the responsibility of managing a collection worth tens of millions of dollars. The key she thought might have antique value had unlocked a treasure that none of them could have imagined. But her message also reminded me that I would have to tell my family about the collection soon. The secret couldn't be kept indefinitely, and I needed their support as I navigated the complex decisions ahead. More importantly, they deserved to understand the true nature of what Grandma Ruth had left behind, even if they hadn't been chosen to inherit it directly. I spent that evening making a list of the people I needed to contact and the decisions I needed to make. The list was daunting. Art authenticators, insurance specialists, museum curators, legal experts, tax advisors, and security consultants. Each conversation would bring new information and new responsibilities, but also new opportunities to honor the legacy that had been entrusted to me. As I prepared for bed, I looked once more at the brass key that had started this incredible journey. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of sharing my discovery with my family, and everything would change. The art teacher who had been pitied and dismissed would have to find a way to explain that she had inherited something beyond their comprehension. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply appreciate the magnitude of what had happened. Grandma Ruth had seen something in me that even I hadn't fully recognized. A deep appreciation for art and creativity that went beyond financial considerations. She had trusted me with a responsibility that would shape the rest of my life, and I was determined to prove worthy of that trust. The key lay on my nightstand, no longer just a piece of old brass but a symbol of the faith that had been placed in my hands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight I was content to know that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The call came at 7 a.m, 2 days after my meeting with Dr. Steinberg. I was standing in my kitchen, still in my pajamas, making coffee, and trying to summon the courage to face another day of life-altering phone calls and decisions. When my phone rang, Jessica's name flashed on the screen, and her voice carried the sharp edge of panic that I'd learned to associate with family crises. "Sarah, we have a problem." Someone from the Ohio State University called Uncle Bob, asking about our family's art collection. They wanted to verify some information about paintings that supposedly belonged to our great-great-grandfather. Uncle Bob has no idea what they're talking about, and he's furious because he thinks someone is trying to run some kind of scam using our family name. My stomach dropped. I'd asked Dr. Steinberg to keep our conversation confidential until I decided how to proceed, but apparently someone from her department had reached out to verify family connections. In academic circles, this was probably standard procedure, but to my family, it would seem like an inexplicable intrusion. Jessica, I can explain that, I said, setting down my coffee cup and trying to keep my voice steady. It's not a scam. There are some things about Grandma Ruth's inheritance that I haven't told you yet. What do you mean, things you haven't told us? Sarah, what's going on? Uncle Bob is talking about calling the police because he thinks someone is trying to use our family name to authenticate fake artwork or something. The conversation I'd been dreading was being forced upon me earlier than I'd planned, and under circumstances that made me sound deceptive rather than cautious. I took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Jessica, I need you to call a family meeting. Tonight, if possible. Get Uncle Bob, Aunt Linda, David, everyone who was at the will reading. There's something about that key that I inherited, something none of us understood when Mr. Anderson read the will. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Jessica spoke again, her voice carried a mixture of confusion and growing concern. Sarah, you're scaring me. What does a rusty old key have to do with art collections and university professors? I'll explain everything tonight, but I need everyone there. And Jessica, please ask Uncle Bob not to call the police or do anything else until I can show you what I've discovered. I promise you, this isn't a scam or a mistake. It's something incredible that Grandma Ruth kept secret for decades. The family meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock at Uncle Bob's house, the sprawling colonial on Elm Street, that had served as the unofficial headquarters for Mitchell family gatherings since I was a child. I spent the day preparing for the most important presentation of my life, gathering documents and photographs that would help my family understand the magnitude of what I'd inherited. Dr. Steinberg had agreed to attend the meeting via video call to provide expert verification of my claims. Mr. Parker from the bank had also agreed to participate remotely to confirm the existence and contents of the vault. I knew that without independent corroboration, my family would never believe what I was about to tell them. I arrived at Uncle Bob's house carrying a briefcase full of photocopied documents and my laptop computer. The familiar smell of Aunt Linda's pot roast filled the air, and for a moment I was transported back to childhood family dinners when my biggest worry was whether I'd remember to bring a hostess gift or say the right thing during grace. The family was already assembled in the living room when I walked in. Uncle Bob sat in his favorite recliner, wearing the expression of barely controlled irritation that he usually reserved for discussing business problems. Jessica and David flanked the couch with their spouses, while Aunt Linda hovered near the doorway as if she might need to make a quick escape. The atmosphere was tense, with curiosity and concern. All right, Sarah, Uncle Bob said without preamble. Explain to me why I'm getting phone calls from professors asking about art collections that supposedly belong to our family. And make it quick, because I've got a conference call with our lawyers at 8:30. I set up my laptop on the coffee table and took a breath that seemed to draw air from the very bottom of my lungs. Before I explain anything, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is completely true, even though it's going to sound impossible. Everything I'm sharing with you has been verified by experts and documented with evidence that goes back over a century. The skeptical expressions around the room made it clear that I was starting from a position of doubt, but I pressed on. The key that I inherited from Grandma Ruth wasn't worthless. It opened a private vault at the First National Bank that has been maintained by our family since 1902. Inside that vault is an art collection that includes works by some of the most important American artists in history. Uncle Bob's expression shifted from irritation to the kind of patronizing concern usually reserved for people experiencing mental health crises. Sarah, honey, I think you might be confused about something. Dad never mentioned any art collection, and I've been involved in all the family's financial affairs for 30 years. There's no way something like that could exist without my knowledge. I opened my laptop and pulled up the photographs I'd taken of the vault's contents. Uncle Bob, I'm going to show you pictures of paintings by Mary Cassatt, Thomas Cole, Georgia O'Keeffe, and at least a dozen other major American artists. Then I'm going to show you the purchase receipts and correspondence that proves our great-great-grandfather bought these works directly from the artists themselves. As I began displaying the photographs on my laptop screen, the room fell silent. The first image showed the Mary Cassatt mother and child portrait, photographed in detail that clearly revealed the texture of the brushstrokes and the signature in the corner. Jessica leaned forward, her expression shifting from skepticism to amazement. "That's beautiful, but Sarah, where did you get this picture? Are you saying this painting is somewhere in Cedar Falls?" "It's in a vault underneath the First National Bank, along with dozens of other works just like it." I clicked to the next image, showing the Thomas Cole landscape with its dramatic mountain scenery and unmistakable Hudson River school style. This painting is by Thomas Cole, one of America's most important landscape artists. According to the documentation I found, our great-great-grandfather purchased it directly from Cole's studio in 1846. David, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "Sarah, do you have any idea what paintings like these are worth? If they're authentic, we're talking about millions of dollars per piece." I nodded, clicking through more images while watching my family's expressions transform from doubt to wonder to something approaching shock. "That's exactly right, David. Conservative estimates put the total value of the collection at somewhere between $50 and $100 million. But the monetary value isn't the most important thing about these works." Uncle Bob had gone completely silent, his business-focused mind clearly racing through the implications of what I was showing them. When I displayed the photograph of the carefully organized filing cabinets and document storage system, he finally found his voice again. "Sarah, if what you're saying is true, why didn't any of us know about this? I've been managing the family's affairs for decades. I've seen Dad's will, his financial records, his insurance policies. There's no mention of any art collection anywhere." I had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer based on the family correspondence I'd found in the vault. The collection was maintained as a separate trust, completely independent from the regular family finances. Each generation designated one person to serve as guardian, someone who would maintain the collection and eventually choose an appropriate heir from the next generation. I clicked to a scan of the letter from my grandfather to Grandma Ruth, the one that explained the selection criteria for guardianship. As I read the letter aloud, emphasizing the passages about choosing someone who understood the cultural rather than just monetary value of art, I could see my family members exchanging glances that seemed to acknowledge, perhaps for the first time, why I might have been chosen for this responsibility. Jessica was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "So Grandma Ruth knew about this collection for 40 years, and she never told any of us? She just quietly maintained it all by herself?" According to the records I found, she visited the vault regularly, corresponded with art historians and museum curators who were trying to locate various pieces, and even added her own painting to the collection. I showed them the photograph of Grandma Ruth's garden scene, explaining how she had documented her inspiration for the work. Aunt Linda, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout my presentation, suddenly stepped forward to get a closer look at the laptop screen. "That's definitely Ruth's style. She took up painting seriously about 10 years ago, said it helped her understand what you were trying to do with your students. I never realized she was actually good at it." The comment revealed something I hadn't fully understood before. Grandma Ruth's decision to choose me as the collection's guardian hadn't been arbitrary or sentimental. She had been observing my work with children, understanding my approach to art education, and recognizing something in my teaching philosophy that aligned with the collection's original purpose. At that moment, my laptop chimed with an incoming video call. Dr. Steinberg's face appeared on the screen, and I introduced her to my family as the art history professor who had verified the significance of the collection. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Steinberg began, addressing Uncle Bob and Aunt Linda with the respectful formality that academic credentials seemed to command. "I want you to understand that your family has been the guardian of something truly extraordinary. The collection that Sarah has inherited represents not just monetary value, but genuine cultural heritage that belongs, in a sense, to all Americans." She spent the next 20 minutes explaining the historical significance of the works I'd discovered, describing how several of the pieces had been considered lost by the academic community and detailing the scholarly importance of the documentation that accompanied each work. Uncle Bob, who had been listening with the focused attention he usually reserved for important business meetings, asked the question that had probably been forming in his mind since the beginning of my presentation. Dr. Steinberg, what would you estimate as the total value of this collection? Mr. Mitchell, conservative auction estimates would place the value at somewhere between $60 and $80 million. However, the true value is significantly higher when you consider the historical importance and the completeness of the provenance documentation. Some of these works are literally priceless from a cultural standpoint. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming the atmosphere in the room from curiosity to something approaching awe. Jessica was the first to break the silence. Sarah, do you realize what this means? You're not just well off now, you're wealthy beyond anything any of us ever imagined. You could buy anything you want, go anywhere you want, do anything you want with your life. But as I looked around the room at my family's faces, I realized that they were still missing the most important point. The collection wasn't about personal wealth or financial freedom. It was about continuing a tradition of supporting American art and artists that had been maintained by our family for over a century. That's not really what this is about, I said, closing my laptop and facing my family directly. Grandma Ruth didn't choose me to inherit this collection because she thought I needed money. She chose me because she trusted me to understand what it really represents and to make decisions about its future that honor its original purpose. I explained my conversations with museum curators about loaning works for public exhibition, my discussions with art historians about scholarly research opportunities, and my growing conviction that the collection needed to be shared rather than hoarded. Uncle Bob's expression had shifted from amazement to something that looked like genuine respect. Sarah, I have to admit, I never understood why you chose teaching over more financially practical career options. But listening to you talk about this collection, about understanding its cultural significance rather than just its monetary value, I'm beginning to see what Ruth saw in you. The acknowledgement from Uncle Bob felt more meaningful than any amount of money could have. For the first time in my adult life, a member of my family was recognizing that my choices had been guided by principles rather than simply poor judgment. David, ever the financial advisor, raised the practical concerns that I'd been grappling with since my discovery. Sarah, what about taxes, insurance, security? A collection like this comes with enormous responsibilities and potential liabilities. I admitted that I was still learning about these practical considerations, but explained that I was working with experts to ensure the collection was properly protected and legally managed. Dr. Steinberg added her own recommendations about insurance and security measures, emphasizing that institutions dealt with these challenges regularly, and that appropriate protections were definitely achievable. As the evening progressed, my family's initial shock gave way to a growing understanding of the magnitude of what had been entrusted to me. They began asking thoughtful questions about my plans for the collection, offering suggestions and support in ways that felt genuine rather than self-serving. Jessica, who had always treated me with the kind of benevolent condescension reserved for unsuccessful relatives, now spoke to me with something approaching admiration. Sarah, I keep thinking about how you've been living paycheck to paycheck while secretly being responsible for something worth more than all of our assets combined. How did you handle that knowledge without telling anyone? The question made me realize that I had changed fundamentally over the past few days. The discovery of the collection hadn't just altered my financial circumstances, it had transformed my understanding of myself and my place within the family. I was no longer the disappointing granddaughter who needed career guidance and financial assistance. I was the person Grandma Ruth had chosen to carry forward a legacy that represented the best of what our family had contributed to American culture. When Mr. Parker joined our video call to confirm the existence and security of the vault, my family's last remaining doubts evaporated. Uncle Bob spent several minutes discussing the practical aspects of maintaining such a collection with the bank manager, while Aunt Linda asked detailed questions about the storage conditions and climate control systems that protected the artwork. As the formal presentations concluded and my family began to process what they'd learned, I felt a profound sense of relief. The secret that had weighed on me for days was finally shared, and instead of the skepticism or jealousy I had feared, I was seeing genuine support and understanding. David was the first to voice what everyone seemed to be thinking. Sarah, we owe you an apology. All of us. We've spent years treating you like you needed our help and guidance, when actually you were the one Grandma Ruth trusted with the most important responsibility in our family's history. The acknowledgement was more meaningful than any of them could have realized. For my entire adult life, I had felt like the family failure, the one who had chosen passion over practicality and was quietly pitied for my poor judgment. Now, suddenly, my choices were being recognized as evidence of the very qualities that had made me worthy of an extraordinary inheritance. As we began discussing my plans for the collection's future, I found myself describing a vision that had been crystallizing over the past few days. I wanted to establish a foundation that would not only preserve and display the collection but also continue the family tradition of supporting American artists. The foundation would provide scholarships for art students, fund exhibitions that brought masterworks to communities that couldn't otherwise access them, and support programs that brought art education to children in underserved areas. Uncle Bob, whose business expertise I had always respected even when it seemed irrelevant to my life, offered to help me navigate the legal and financial complexities of establishing such a foundation. Jessica volunteered to use her social connections to build support for the foundation's mission. David suggested strategies for managing the collection's assets to generate ongoing funding for educational programs. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like a truly valued member of the Mitchell family, not because of what I might become with their guidance, but because of who I already was. As the evening wound down and family members began preparing to leave, Aunt Linda approached me with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I want you to know that Ruth would be so proud of how you're handling this. She always said you had a special understanding of what really matters in life, but I don't think any of us appreciated what she meant until tonight." The drive home took me past the house on Maple Street where Grandma Ruth had lived, the house that Jessica had inherited and was already planning to renovate. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, looking up at the kitchen window where my grandmother and I had shared so many Sunday afternoon conversations. I thought about the garden behind the house, the one Grandma Ruth had painted, and that had inspired her final artistic creation. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of establishing the foundation that would honor her memory and continue the family tradition she had maintained for 4 decades. The collection would finally emerge from its hidden vault to fulfill its true purpose of inspiring and educating people who shared my grandmother's belief in the transformative power of art. The brass key still rested in my purse, no longer a mystery but a symbol of the trust that had been placed in my hands. As I drove home to my small apartment, which I now realized I could replace with any residence I desired, I understood that the most valuable thing I had inherited wasn't wealth or prestige, but the opportunity to make a difference in ways that aligned with my deepest values. 6 months later, I stood in the main gallery of the newly opened Mitchell American Art Foundation, watching a group of second graders from Cedar Falls Elementary gather around the Mary Cassatt mother and child portrait. Their teacher, a young woman who reminded me of myself at their age, was explaining how artists use color and light to create emotion, while the children absorbed every word with the kind of intense focus that only comes from genuine wonder. The foundation occupied a beautiful converted warehouse in downtown Cedar Falls, with climate-controlled galleries, educational studios, and a research library that attracted scholars from across the country. The collection rotated regularly between our permanent displays and traveling exhibitions that brought these masterworks to communities throughout Ohio and beyond. Uncle Bob served on the foundation's board of directors, bringing his business expertise to help us operate efficiently and sustainably. Jessica had become our most effective fundraiser, using her social connections to build support for our educational programs. David managed our financial assets, ensuring that the foundation would have the resources to fulfill its mission for generations to come. But the most rewarding aspect of the foundation was watching children discover their own artistic potential in our educational studios. We offered free classes for students from low-income families, scholarships for talented young artists, and teacher training programs that helped educators incorporate art appreciation into their curricula. The brass key that had started this incredible journey now rested in a place of honor in my office, displayed alongside a letter from the mayor of Cedar Falls, thanking the foundation for our contribution to the community's cultural life. Letters from students, teachers, and parents covered the walls, describing how our programs had inspired creativity, built confidence, and opened new possibilities for young people who might never have discovered their artistic talents otherwise. As I watched those second graders sketch their own interpretations of the Cassatt painting, I thought about Grandma Ruth and the incredible gift she had given me. She had seen something in my work with children that I hadn't fully recognized in myself, understanding that my commitment to art education wasn't just a career choice, but a calling that aligned perfectly with our family's century-long tradition of supporting American artists. The family that had once laughed at my worthless inheritance now served as my partners in fulfilling the most meaningful work of my life. They had learned, as I had, that true value isn't measured in dollars or status, but in the difference we make in other people's lives and the legacy we leave for future generations. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by masterworks that had been hidden for over a century and were now inspiring a new generation of artists, I understood that Grandma Ruth's final gift hadn't been a collection of valuable paintings. It had been the opportunity to discover my own worth, and to use that discovery to create something beautiful and lasting in the world. 2 years had passed since that life-changing evening in Uncle Bob's living room, and I found myself standing in the marble foyer of the Smithsonian's American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., watching curators carefully install the centerpiece of our traveling exhibition, the Mary Cassatt mother and child portrait that had once been dismissed as lost to history. The museum's director, Dr. Patricia Chambers, stood beside me with barely contained excitement as workers positioned the painting under specially designed lighting that would showcase every delicate brushstroke. "Miss Mitchell," Dr. Chambers said, her voice filled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. "I've been a museum director for 23 years, and I've never had the privilege of presenting a collection with such extraordinary provenance and cultural significance. The fact that your family maintained these works in pristine condition for over a century is nothing short of miraculous." The exhibition, titled Hidden Treasures, the Mitchell Collection and American Art Patronage, had already broken attendance records at 3 previous venues. Our first stop had been the Cleveland Museum of Art, where lines stretched around the block as people waited hours to see paintings that had been hidden from public view for generations. The response had been so overwhelming that we'd had to extend the exhibition by 6 weeks and implement timed entry to manage the crowds. From Cleveland, the collection had traveled to the Detroit Institute of Arts, where it had inspired a citywide celebration of American artistic heritage. Local schools had organized special field trips, and the museum had reported that their educational programs had reached more children during the 3 months of our exhibition than in any previous year in their history. Now, as we prepared for the Washington opening, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that moment when I'd first turned the brass key in Vault 247. The quiet art teacher who had once worried about paying her electric bill was now the director of one of the most respected private foundations in the American Midwest, managing an endowment that supported dozens of educational programs and had already provided college scholarships to over 300 aspiring artists. But the transformation hadn't been limited to my professional circumstances. The Mitchell American Art Foundation had become a catalyst for change throughout Cedar Falls and the surrounding communities. Our presence had attracted other cultural organizations to the area, and property values in downtown Cedar Falls had increased by 40% as the district transformed into a recognized arts destination. The economic impact had been significant, but the cultural change had been even more profound. Children who had never set foot in an art museum were now regular visitors to our galleries. Teachers who had been forced to eliminate art programs due to budget cuts were receiving grants that allowed them to restore and expand their curricula. Young people who might never have considered careers in the arts were discovering their talents through our scholarship programs and mentorship opportunities. Emma, who had been promoted to Director of Community Outreach for the Foundation, joined me in the Smithsonian foyer as the installation work continued. She carried a tablet loaded with the latest statistics from our programs, numbers that still amazed me every time I reviewed them. "Sarah, look at these figures from last quarter," she said, showing me graphs that tracked the participation rates in our various initiatives. "We've now provided art supplies to over 50 schools across 3 counties. And the teachers are reporting significant improvements in student engagement across all subjects, not just art classes." The data supported something I'd always believed but had never been able to prove. that exposure to art education didn't just create artists, it enhanced students' overall academic performance and emotional development. Children who participated in our programs showed improved critical thinking skills, better self-expression abilities, and increased confidence that carried over into other areas of their lives. The really exciting news, Emma continued, is the response we're getting from the university partnerships. Ohio State wants to expand their art education program specifically to prepare teachers for the kind of integrated curriculum we're promoting. They're offering to name their new graduate fellowship program after your grandmother. The proposal to honor Grandma Ruth's memory in such a meaningful way brought tears to my eyes. She would have been thrilled to know that her legacy was inspiring future generations of art educators, teachers who would carry forward the belief that creativity and beauty were essential components of human development. As we walked through the Smithsonian galleries, I noticed families gathering around our exhibition pieces, parents reading the detailed placards to their children, while the young ones stared in wonder at colors and compositions that had been hidden from public view for over a century. An elderly man was explaining to his grandson how Thomas Cole had influenced an entire generation of American landscape painters, while a young mother helped her daughter sketch her own interpretation of a Georgia O'Keeffe flower painting. These scenes reinforced my conviction that the decision to share the collection publicly rather than sell it privately had been the right choice. Every person who stood before these paintings was participating in a cultural experience that had been made possible by 4 generations of Mitchell family guardians, who had understood that some things were too important to be valued purely in monetary terms. Dr. Marcus Williams, the chief curator of American art at the Smithsonian, approached our group with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from a lifetime dedicated to preserving cultural heritage. He'd been working with us for months to prepare educational materials that would help visitors understand not just the artistic significance of individual pieces, but the broader story of American art patronage that the collection represented. Miss Mitchell, I wanted you to know that we've already received inquiries from international museums about borrowing pieces from your collection for their American art exhibitions. The Louvre is particularly interested in your Georgia O'Keeffe works for their upcoming survey of American modernism, and the Tate Modern has asked about including several pieces in their exhibition on transatlantic artistic exchange. The international interest was flattering, but it also raised questions about how far we should extend our loan programs. Each time a painting traveled, it was exposed to additional risks, even with the most sophisticated climate control and security measures. Our insurance costs had already increased dramatically as the collection's exposure had grown, and we were constantly balancing the benefits of public access against the responsibilities of preservation. Dr. Williams, I'm definitely interested in exploring international loans, but I want to make sure we're being strategic about it. Our primary mission is still serving American communities, especially those that don't normally have access to collections like this. He nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. I'd suggest we consider one major international loan per year, perhaps rotating between European and Asian venues. That would give the collection global exposure, while ensuring that most of its time is spent serving American audiences. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself in conversations with journalists, scholars, and art lovers who had traveled from across the country to attend the exhibition opening. Each conversation reinforced my understanding of how the collection's emergence had filled a significant gap in American cultural institutions. A reporter from Art News asked me about the decision-making process that had led to establishing the foundation rather than selling the collection at auction. Her question forced me to articulate something I'd been thinking about for months, but had never expressed publicly. When my grandmother chose me to inherit this collection, she wasn't just passing on valuable artwork, I explained. She was entrusting me with a responsibility that extends far beyond any individual or family. These paintings represent the creative spirit of America during some of its most important historical periods. They belong in a very real sense to all Americans, and my job is to ensure they can fulfill that purpose. The reporter pressed further, asking about the financial sacrifices involved in choosing public service over private gain. The question made me think about the life I might have lived if I'd chosen to sell the collection and keep the proceeds for myself. I could have purchased a mansion, traveled the world, lived in luxury that most people could only dream about. But as I looked around the Smithsonian galleries, watching visitors engage with masterworks that had been hidden for over a century, I realized that no amount of personal wealth could have provided the satisfaction I felt from seeing the collection fulfill its intended purpose. The paintings weren't just decorating my walls. They were inspiring thousands of people, supporting educational programs, and contributing to the cultural enrichment of entire communities. That evening, the foundation hosted a reception for major donors, museum directors, and art education advocates from across the country. The event was held in one of the Smithsonian's private function rooms, with several pieces from our collection displayed for the intimate gathering. Uncle Bob, who had traveled to Washington for the opening, found me during the cocktail hour. His transformation over the past 2 years had been as remarkable as my own. The businessman who had once offered me a job in the paint department out of pity was now one of the foundation's most effective advocates, using his professional connections to build support for our mission. "Sarah, I had lunch with Senator Morrison yesterday," he said, referring to Ohio's senior senator who had become a champion of arts education funding. "She wants to introduce legislation that would provide federal matching funds for foundations like ours that support arts education in rural communities. She says our model could be replicated across the country." The possibility of federal support was exciting, but it also represented a level of visibility and responsibility that I was still learning to navigate. Success brought new opportunities, but it also attracted attention from people and organizations whose motivations weren't always aligned with our mission. Jessica approached us, elegant in a navy dress that perfectly complemented her role as the foundation's director of development. Her fundraising efforts had been crucial to our expansion, bringing in additional resources that allowed us to serve more communities while maintaining the highest standards of care for the collection. "Sarah, I just finished talking with the Kellerton Foundation Board," she said, referring to a major philanthropy organization based in Chicago. "They want to fund a pilot program that would bring our educational model to inner-city schools in 5 major metropolitan areas. We're talking about reaching over 10,000 students in the first year alone." The scale of the opportunity was breathtaking, but it also forced me to confront questions about how rapidly we should expand our operations. Growth brought exciting possibilities, but it also increased the complexity of our mission and the risk of losing the personal touch that had made our initial programs so successful. David joined our conversation, carrying a folder of financial projections that reflected his ongoing role as the foundation's treasurer. His analytical skills had proven invaluable in managing our resources and ensuring that our ambitious programs remained financially sustainable. "I've been running some numbers on the expansion proposals," he said, opening the folder to show charts and graphs that tracked our current capacity against projected growth. "We could definitely handle the Metropolitan Pilot Program, but we'd need to hire additional staff and possibly establish satellite offices in each target city." The discussion continued throughout the evening, with family members who had once dismissed my career choices now serving as my most trusted advisors in managing a foundation that had exceeded all of our initial expectations. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I'd moved beyond finding satisfaction in their changed attitudes. What mattered now was working together to maximize our positive impact. As the reception wound down, I found myself standing alone before the Georgia O'Keeffe flower painting that had become one of the most recognizable pieces in our collection. The work's bold colors and innovative composition had influenced generations of American artists, and seeing it displayed in the nation's premier art museum felt like a homecoming for a masterpiece that had been in exile for too long. Dr. Chambers joined me in front of the painting, and we stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes before she spoke. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you understand the magnitude of what you've accomplished. This collection isn't just bringing beauty into people's lives, it's changing how Americans think about art, culture, and the responsibility that comes with cultural heritage." Her words resonated with something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. The foundation had become more than an institution that displayed artwork and provided educational programs. It had become a model for how private cultural assets could serve public purposes, demonstrating that individual families could make choices that benefited entire communities and future generations. The following morning, I woke early in my hotel room and walked to the National Mall before the crowds arrived. The early morning light cast long shadows across the monuments and memorials that honored America's political and military heroes, and I thought about how art and culture played equally important roles in defining national identity. The paintings in our collection told the story of America's artistic development, but they also reflected the country's evolving understanding of beauty, nature, and human relationships. Thomas Cole's landscapes captured the nation's sense of manifest destiny and natural grandeur. Mary Cassatt's intimate family scenes reflected changing attitudes toward childhood and domesticity. Georgia O'Keeffe's bold abstractions embodied the modernist spirit that would transform American art in the 20th century. By preserving and sharing these works, we were ensuring that future generations would have access to visual documents of their cultural heritage, artworks that communicated aspects of the American experience that couldn't be captured in textbooks or historical records. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. CNN wants to interview you for their Sunday morning show. They're doing a segment on private philanthropy and cultural preservation. Interested? The media attention had been constant since the collection's public debut, with journalists and broadcasters eager to tell the story of the hidden art treasure and the family that had chosen to share it rather than profit from it. I'd given dozens of interviews, always emphasizing that the real story wasn't about the monetary value of the collection, but about the continuing tradition of supporting American artists and arts education. As I walked back toward the hotel, I passed groups of tourists already heading toward the Smithsonian museums, many carrying the distinctive blue brochures that promoted our exhibition. Children clutched coloring books featuring simplified versions of paintings from our collection, while parents consulted maps that would guide them through galleries they might never have visited without the draw of our hidden treasures. The impact extended beyond the walls of any single museum. Our traveling exhibition had inspired other private collectors to reconsider their own approaches to cultural stewardship. At least 6 families had contacted us about establishing similar foundations, and several major collectors had announced plans to increase public access to their holdings. Later that morning, I participated in a panel discussion at the museum about the role of private foundations in supporting arts education. My fellow panelists included directors from major museums, education policy experts, and representatives from other cultural foundations. The conversation focused on strategies for making art education more accessible to underserved communities, but it also addressed broader questions about cultural equity and the responsibility that comes with cultural wealth. Several panelists noted that our foundation's success had helped demonstrate that private cultural assets could serve public purposes without compromising their integrity or value. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the education director at the Getty Foundation, raised a point that had been central to our own strategic planning. The Mitchell Foundation has shown that it's possible to maintain the highest standards of conservation and scholarship while dramatically expanding public access. Their model proves that we don't have to choose between preservation and accessibility. The discussion reinforced my conviction that we had chosen the right path, but it also highlighted the ongoing challenges we faced. Balancing preservation with access required constant vigilance and significant resources. Every loan, every exhibition, every educational program had to be carefully planned to ensure that we were serving our mission without compromising our ability to preserve the collection for future generations. That afternoon, I received a call that would shape the next phase of our foundation's development. The caller was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the director of the National Endowment for the Arts, who had been following our work with great interest. Ms. Mitchell, I'm calling to invite you to serve on a federal task force that's being established to develop new models for public-private partnerships in arts education, she said. Your foundation's success has caught the attention of policymakers who are looking for innovative approaches to cultural funding and programming. The invitation represented both an honor and a new level of responsibility. Serving on a federal task force would provide opportunities to influence national policy and potentially help replicate our model in other communities. But it would also require time and energy that I was currently devoting to our local programs. Dr. Chen, I'm definitely interested, but I want to make sure I understand the scope of the commitment. Our foundation is still relatively young, and I don't want to compromise our existing programs by taking on too much, too quickly. She assured me that the task force was designed to learn from successful programs rather than divert resources from them, and that my participation would primarily involve sharing our experiences and insights rather than developing new initiatives from scratch. As I considered the opportunity, I thought about Grandma Ruth and what she would have advised. She had always believed in thinking beyond immediate circumstances to consider long-term impact and broader responsibilities. The task force would provide a platform to influence arts education policy at the national level, potentially helping thousands of communities develop their own versions of what we had accomplished in Cedar Falls. That evening, I called a conference meeting with my family members who served on the foundation board. We discussed the federal task force opportunity, the expansion proposals we'd been considering, and the strategic decisions that would shape our next phase of growth. Uncle Bob, ever the pragmatist, focused on the practical implications. Sarah, you've built something remarkable here, but you can't do everything. If you're going to take on national responsibilities, we need to make sure we have the staff and systems in place to maintain the quality of our local programs. Jessica emphasized the fundraising implications. The federal visibility could open doors to major national donors, but it might also create expectations about our capacity that we're not ready to meet yet. David analyzed the financial projections. We're in good shape financially, but scaling up to a national level would require significant new resources and probably a more complex organizational structure. Their concerns were valid, but as I listened to their advice, I realized that the opportunity represented exactly the kind of thinking that had guided our family's stewardship of the collection for over a century. Each generation had been called to make decisions that extended beyond their immediate circumstances to consider the long-term impact of their choices. I think we need to say yes to the task force, I said finally. Not because we're ready to become a national organization tomorrow, but because we have insights and experiences that could help other communities access the same kinds of opportunities we've been able to provide here. The decision felt right, in the same way that the original choice to establish the foundation had felt right. We weren't just managing a collection of valuable artwork. We were participating in a larger conversation about cultural responsibility and the role that art plays in building strong, healthy communities. 6 months later, I stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, watching the president sign legislation that would provide federal matching funds for community-based arts education foundations. The bill, inspired partly by our foundation's success, would help dozens of communities across the country develop their own programs for supporting young artists and expanding access to cultural education. The ceremony represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with a tarnished brass key and a family's laughter. The art teacher, who had once been pitied for her impractical career choices, was now advising federal policymakers on strategies for cultural development and arts education. But as I watched the president hand me the signing pen as a commemorative gift, I thought about the second graders in Cedar Falls, who were at that very moment creating their own masterpieces in our foundation studios. They were the real measure of our success, the living proof that art education could transform lives and communities in ways that no amount of money or recognition could duplicate. The brass key now rested in a place of honor in our foundation's main gallery, displayed alongside a timeline that traced the collection's history from William Mitchell's first purchase in 1902 through its emergence as a public cultural resource in the 21st century. Visitors often asked about the key's significance, and I never tired of telling the story of how something that appeared worthless had unlocked not just a hidden treasure, but a new understanding of what it means to be a responsible steward of cultural heritage. The family that had once laughed at my inheritance now served as my closest advisors and strongest supporters, but their changed attitudes were less important than the changed lives of the thousands of students, teachers, and families who had been touched by the programs we'd been able to create. Art had the power to transform not just individual lives but entire communities, and we had been given the extraordinary privilege of proving that truth on a scale that previous generations could never have imagined. As I flew back to Cedar Falls after the White House ceremony, I looked down at the American landscape passing beneath the plane and thought about all the communities where similar stories of cultural discovery and artistic transformation were waiting to unfold. Our foundation had shown that one family's commitment to supporting art and artists could create ripple effects that extended far beyond their original intentions, inspiring others to recognize their own capacity for cultural stewardship and community development. The brass key had unlocked more than a vault full of valuable paintings. It had unlocked an understanding of what becomes possible when people choose to measure worth, not in dollars accumulated but in lives enriched. Not in status achieved, but in legacies created. Not in personal gain realized, but in public good advanced. Grandma Ruth had been right to choose me not because I was the most successful member of the family, but because I understood that true success couldn't be measured by conventional standards. The greatest treasures weren't hidden in bank vaults. They were waiting to be discovered in the hearts and minds of young people who just needed someone to believe in their potential and provide them with the tools to express their unique vision of beauty and truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.